The morning sun peeked through Eleanor's kitchen window as she sipped her tea, flipping through her mail without much interest. Bills, advertisements, more bills. Her fingers paused on a cream-colored envelope, heavier than the others with elegant handwriting that didn't match her usual correspondence. "What's this?" she murmured to herself, running her finger under the sealed flap. Inside was an invitation card embossed with gold lettering. Eleanor adjusted her reading glasses, her heart doing a small jump as she read the words. "The Metropolitan Arts Foundation cordially invites you to attend the annual Autumn Piano Recital. Featuring distinguished performers and Maestro Vittorio Castellano." Eleanor sat down heavily in her kitchen chair. The Metropolitan Arts Foundation was the most prestigious music organization in the city, and Maestro Castellano was a legend. His recordings had kept her company through many lonely evenings, his interpretations of Chopin making her weep into her knitting. But why had they invited her? Eleanor was nobody in the music world, just a piano teacher from Pine Creek, a town so small it barely registered on most maps. Her students were neighborhood children whose parents hoped music might improve their math scores, not prodigies bound for fame. At the bottom of the invitation, a handwritten note caught her eye. "This year's recital will include an impromptu session where select attendees may have an opportunity to perform." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she set the invitation on her kitchen table. She glanced toward the living room where her upright piano stood against the wall, sheet music organized neatly on top. For 25 years, that piano had been her confidant, therapist, and closest friend. Don't be ridiculous, she told herself. They probably sent invitations to all the music teachers in the region. It's just courtesy, but a small voice inside her whispered, "What if?" Eleanor walked to her piano, sat on the bench that had molded to her shape after thousands of hours, and opened the bottom drawer. From beneath a stack of classical sonatas, she pulled out a worn folder labeled Personal Compositions. The pages inside were yellowed at the edges, filled with her careful handwriting, notes, dynamics, tempo markings. Her fingers traced the title of her favorite piece, one she'd been refining for nearly 7 years. Echoes of Ordinary Magic. No one had ever heard it. Not her students, not her few friends, not even her sister Rose, who called every Sunday. The composition was too personal, too revealing of Eleanor's inner landscape, her disappointments, her small joys, the beauty she found in everyday moments that others rushed past. Eleanor placed the sheets on the piano stand and began to play, closing her eyes as the familiar melody wrapped around her like an old quilt. The music started simply, almost hesitantly, before building into something more complex and surprising. When she finished, the final notes seemed to hover in her little living room. The grandfather clock in the corner, inherited from her mother, ticked away the silence. "This is madness," Eleanor said aloud, though there was no one to hear but her cat, Frederick, who was sprawled in a patch of sunlight. "I'm 42 years old. Too old for silly dreams." But the invitation seemed to pulse with possibility on her kitchen table. That evening, Eleanor called her sister. "A piano recital at the Metropolitan," Rose said, her voice crackling over the phone line. "Ellie, you have to go. When was the last time you did something exciting?" "The question is, why would I go?" Eleanor replied, twisting the phone cord around her finger. "I'd be completely out of place." "Because you love music more than anyone I know," Rose said simply. "And because Mom would have wanted you to." Their mother had been Eleanor's first teacher, guiding her small fingers over the keys of the family's old piano. "Music is how the soul speaks when words fail," she used to say. She died when Eleanor was 19, leaving behind the piano and a daughter who found refuge in its sounds. "What would I even wear?" Eleanor asked, already weakening. "Something that makes you feel brave," Rose answered. 2 weeks later, Eleanor found herself standing before her bedroom mirror in a midnight blue dress she'd bought on sale 5 years ago for a cousin's wedding. It was modest and a bit outdated, but it was the nicest thing she owned. Her honey brown hair was twisted into a simple bun, with a few strands framing her face. She'd applied light makeup, just enough to bring some color to her cheeks and define her hazel eyes, which looked back at her with apprehension. "You look perfectly fine," she told her reflection, though fine wasn't what she was hoping for. In her hands, she clutched a leather portfolio containing her composition. She had debated for days whether to bring it, finally deciding it would be better to have it and not need it than the reverse. The chances of her actually playing were slim to none, she reasoned, but having the music with her felt like carrying a talisman. The drive to the city took almost 2 hours. Eleanor rarely ventured beyond Pine Creek's boundaries, and the growing skyline made her stomach flutter with nerves. She parked in the public garage 2 blocks from the concert hall, carefully locking her ancient Honda before setting off down the unfamiliar street. The Westfield Concert Hall loomed ahead, its classical columns and broad stairs intimidating in their grandeur. People streamed toward the entrance, women in elegant dresses, men in tailored suits, all of them seeming to move with the confidence of belonging. Eleanor clutched her portfolio tighter and joined the flow, feeling like a sparrow among peacocks. Inside, the hall was even more overwhelming: crystal chandeliers, red velvet seats, gilt decorations catching the light. Ushers in formal attire directed patrons to their seats. Eleanor presented her invitation with a shaky hand and was guided to a seat in the middle section, not too close but not too far from the stage. As she settled in, Eleanor observed the people around her. To her right sat an older gentleman with silver hair and a distinguished profile. To her left, a young couple whispered to each other excitedly. Everyone seemed to know someone. Conversations bubbled around her, filled with names of conservatories, competitions, and composers. Eleanor sat quietly, her portfolio on her lap, feeling increasingly out of place. What had she been thinking? This world wasn't hers. These people had studied at Juilliard and Curtis, had traveled to Vienna and Prague for master classes. She'd learned piano in her mother's living room, and had never ventured farther than the state line for a workshop at the community college. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience. A distinguished man in his 60s walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. Eleanor recognized him immediately from album covers and music magazines. Maestro Vittorio Castellano. He had a commanding presence with thick white hair and intense dark eyes that seemed to see everything. "Welcome to our annual autumn recital," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hall. "Tonight, we celebrate both established talents and new voices in the world of piano. We begin with our scheduled performers, and later, we will have our traditional impromptu session where fortune may favor the bold." His gaze swept across the audience, and for a fleeting second, Eleanor felt as though he looked directly at her. She shrank back in her seat, her palms suddenly damp. The first performer took the stage, a young man with confident posture who launched into a technically flawless rendition of Liszt. Eleanor listened, appreciating his skill but noting the lack of emotional connection to the piece. The audience, however, erupted in enthusiastic applause when he finished. 3 more pianists followed, each impressive in their execution. During the performances, Eleanor noticed Maestro Castellano sitting in the front row, his expression giving nothing away as he listened with complete concentration. When the 4th performer completed a dramatic Rachmaninoff piece, the maestro announced a 20-minute intermission. People rose from their seats, heading to the lobby for refreshments or gathering in small clusters to discuss the performances. Eleanor remained seated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Finally, she decided to stretch her legs and perhaps find a restroom. As she made her way through the crowd, she overheard snippets of conversation. "Chen's technique was impeccable, but I found his interpretation a bit academic. Did you hear that Sophia will be performing with the Philharmonic next season? The last time I was in Budapest, the piano they provided was completely unacceptable." Eleanor felt like she was walking through a foreign country without knowing the language. She found the ladies' room and spent a few extra minutes inside, gathering her courage before facing the crowd again. In the lobby, she noticed a small table with programs and information about the Metropolitan Arts Foundation. A friendly-looking woman stood behind it. Eleanor approached, hoping for a moment of human connection. "Excuse me," she said softly. The woman was engaged in conversation with a well-dressed man and didn't seem to hear Eleanor. "Pardon me." Eleanor tried again, a bit louder. A group of animated conservatory students moved between them, and when they passed, the woman was already helping someone else. Eleanor backed away, clutching her portfolio to her chest like armor. She turned and nearly bumped into a tall, thin woman with a severe bun. "I'm so sorry," Eleanor apologized. The woman gave her a quick once-over and continued on without acknowledgement. Standing alone in the crowded lobby, Eleanor felt a wave of doubt wash over her. What was she doing here? This wasn't her world. These weren't her people. She should leave now, drive back to Pine Creek and forget this silly adventure. But then the bell chimed, signaling the end of intermission. And despite everything, Eleanor couldn't bring herself to walk out the door. The music called to her even if the people did not. She returned to her seat, holding her composition close, a small piece of her true self in a room full of strangers. The lights dimmed again, and the second half of the recital began. The second half of the recital began with a flurry of activity, as a young woman in a scarlet gown took the stage. Her confident stride and the toss of her long dark hair spoke of someone accustomed to attention. The audience straightened in their seats. Eleanor heard whispers around her. That's Lucia Valenti. She studied with the great Horowitz's last student. They say she's Castellano's favorite. Eleanor watched as Lucia sat at the piano with practiced grace, taking a moment to compose herself before beginning. When her fingers touched the keys, it was as if the entire hall held its breath. She played Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece Eleanor had taught countless times, but never like this. Lucia's interpretation was technically brilliant, her fingers dancing across the keys with effortless precision. Yet as the familiar melody filled the hall, Eleanor felt something was missing. The notes were perfect, but they didn't reach inside her the way they should. It was like looking at a flawless photograph of a sunset instead of witnessing the real thing, with all its imperfections and unexpected beauty. When Lucia finished, the audience erupted in thunderous applause. Many rose to their feet. Even Maestro Castellano nodded his approval, the first visible reaction he'd shown all evening. 3 more pianists performed, each one showcasing impressive technical skill. Eleanor listened attentively, her trained ear noting their strengths and occasional weaknesses. One young man played Beethoven with such intensity that his passion nearly made up for his minor timing issues. A woman in her 30s performed a contemporary piece that left Eleanor intrigued, but slightly confused by its experimental structure. Throughout these performances, Eleanor clutched her portfolio, her composition feeling increasingly inadequate with each virtuoso display. What had possessed her to think her simple melody could stand among these polished performers? She was a piano teacher from a small town who played for children's recitals and the occasional church service. These people had performed in concert halls across Europe when the last scheduled performer completed their piece, a dramatic rendition of Tchaikovsky that left the audience breathless. Maestro Castellano returned to the stage. Eleanor expected him to conclude the evening, but instead, he raised his hands for silence. Now we come to a cherished tradition of our annual autumn recital, he announced, his resonant voice carrying to the far corners of the hall. The impromptu session, where we invite a few brave souls from our audience to share their talents. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. The impromptu session was actually happening. She hadn't imagined it would really take place, had thought it might be just a formality mentioned on the invitation. We have time for 3 short performances, the maestro continued. Any volunteers? Several hands shot up immediately. Eleanor's own remained firmly in her lap, though her fingers twitched with indecision. You, in the burgundy jacket. Castellano pointed to a confident-looking man in his 40s. The man strode to the stage with the ease of someone who belonged there. He introduced himself as a professor of music theory at the State University and launched into a technically challenging piece by Prokofiev. Eleanor recognized it as one that required years of training to master. He played well, though his interpretation lacked subtlety. When he finished, Castellano gave him a polite nod. Thank you, Professor. Next. He selected a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20. She was dressed simply compared to many in the audience, but her face shone with eagerness as she approached the piano. I'm a second-year student at the conservatory, she announced in a clear voice. I'll be playing my own arrangement of a Bach partita. Her playing was fresh and innovative, bringing new life to the centuries-old composition. Eleanor found herself leaning forward, genuinely enjoying the young woman's interpretation. When she finished, the audience gave her enthusiastic applause, and even the maestro seemed impressed. Excellent, he said. We have time for one more. More hands went up. Eleanor's remained down, though she found herself holding her breath, her portfolio warm beneath her fingers. The maestro scanned the audience, his gaze sweeping past Eleanor without pause. He pointed to someone in the front row, a gray-haired man who stood with the confidence of someone long accustomed to acclaim. "Dr. Winters from the Philharmonic," the maestro announced. "This is an unexpected pleasure." A murmur of excitement passed through the crowd. Dr. Winters was apparently someone of significance. Eleanor watched as he made his way to the stage, accepting the maestro's handshake with practiced ease. "I'll play a short piece I've been working on for an upcoming concert series," Dr. Winters said into the microphone, his voice carrying the cultivated accent of someone educated in Europe. He seated himself at the piano and began to play a complex, modern piece that made Eleanor furrow her brow in concentration. It was technically impressive but emotionally distant, like advanced mathematics translated into sound. She could appreciate the skill but couldn't connect with the music itself. As he played, Eleanor glanced around at the audience. Many were watching with rapt attention, nodding at particularly difficult passages. Others seemed to share her confusion, their expressions politely interested but not moved. When Dr. Winters finished, the audience applauded vigorously. The maestro shook his hand again, saying something that made the older man smile with satisfaction. "And with that," Castellano announced, turning back to the audience, "we conclude our impromptu." He stopped mid-sentence as an event coordinator hurried onto the stage and whispered something in his ear. The maestro's expression darkened momentarily before he nodded and turned back to the microphone. "It seems we have one more scheduled performer for our impromptu session," he said, checking his watch with barely concealed impatience. "Unfortunately, they appear to be—" He paused as the coordinator whispered to him again. "Ah, I see. It seems our final performer has encountered some difficulty and will not be joining us tonight." An awkward moment of silence fell over the hall. The coordinator looked flustered, whispering urgently to the maestro, who frowned and shook his head slightly. Eleanor realized they were facing an unexpected gap in the program, something all performers and organizers dreaded. The careful timing of the evening had been disrupted. The coordinator's distress was visible even from where Eleanor sat. In that moment, something shifted inside her. It wasn't confidence exactly, more like a quiet certainty that if she didn't take this chance, she would forever wonder what might have been. Her mother's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, "Music is how the soul speaks when words fail." Before she could talk herself out of it, Eleanor raised her hand. The coordinator, scanning the audience desperately, noticed her movement and pointed her out to the maestro. Castellano followed the gesture, his eyes landing on Eleanor with a mixture of relief and skepticism. "It appears we have a volunteer after all," he said, his voice betraying slight surprise. "You in the blue dress?" Every head in the auditorium turned toward Eleanor. She felt her cheeks flush with heat, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the people beside her must hear it. For a terrifying second, she considered lowering her hand and pretending she had been merely adjusting her hair. Instead, she stood, clutching her portfolio to her chest like a shield. "Your name, please?" the maestro asked, his voice carrying an undertone that suggested he was merely being polite by allowing this unexpected addition. "Eleanor," she said, her voice so quiet it barely carried. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Eleanor Winters." A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, crossed the maestro's face. "Another Winters. No relation to our good doctor, I presume?" "No," Eleanor said, making her way to the aisle. No relation. The walk to the stage felt endless. Eleanor was acutely aware of every eye upon her, of the whispers that followed her progress. Her sensible shoes made little sound on the carpeted aisle, then clicked softly as she ascended the steps to the stage. Up close, the grand piano was even more magnificent than it had appeared from her seat, a gleaming black Steinway that probably cost more than her house. The maestro stood nearby, his expression unreadable as he watched her approach. "And what will you be playing for us tonight, Ms. Winters?" he asked, his tone suggesting he expected her to name a simple piece, perhaps something by Mozart or a basic Chopin nocturne. "My own composition," Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than she expected. "It's called Echoes of Ordinary Magic." Maestro Castellano's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of his surprise. He gestured toward the piano with a practiced sweep of his hand, then stepped back, pulling his phone from his pocket as he did so. Eleanor saw him glance at the screen, his attention already drifting as he took a seat in the front row. The coordinator hovered uncertainly at the edge of the stage before hurrying off, clearly relieved that the gap in the program had been filled, regardless of by whom. Eleanor stood alone now, facing the sea of faces. Some looked curious, others impatient. Many had already begun quiet conversations, assuming this unexpected addition would be of little interest. She took a deep breath and moved to the piano, placing her well-worn sheets on the stand with trembling hands. The bench felt different from her familiar one at home, higher, firmer. She adjusted it slightly, buying herself a moment to gather her courage. As her fingers hovered over the keys, Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw her small living room, her cat sleeping in the patch of sunlight, her mother's photograph watching over the piano. This piece was born there, in those quiet moments between teaching and chores, in the still hours when the world slept and she could finally play for herself alone. She opened her eyes, placed her fingers on the cool ivory keys and began to play. Eleanor's fingers touched the keys, and the first notes of her composition filled the concert hall. She began softly, tentatively, as if testing the waters of a vast ocean. The melody was simple at first, a quiet conversation between her right and left hands, like two old friends meeting after years apart. In the front row, Maestro Castellano continued scrolling through his phone, glancing up occasionally with polite disinterest. Around the hall, audience members shifted in their seats, some checking their watches, others whispering behind raised programs. Eleanor sensed their impatience but forced herself to focus only on the keys beneath her fingers. Her composition began with a theme inspired by early mornings in Pine Creek, the gentle awakening of her small town as shopkeepers raised their shutters and birds called to each other across still quiet streets. As she played, Eleanor's nervousness began to recede like an outgoing tide. This was her music, the language she knew best. She moved into the second movement, where the tempo increased slightly. This part represented her mother's illness, the confusion, the doctor visits, the hope that rose and fell like an irregular heartbeat. Her left hand played a steady, somber bass line, while her right hand created a melody that seemed to search for something just beyond reach. A small technical error made her stumble briefly. Eleanor winced but continued, breathing through the mistake as she'd taught her own students to do. Music isn't about perfection, she always told them. It's about truth. In the audience, a few people who had been conversing quietly fell silent, their attention caught by something unexpected in her playing. It wasn't the flawless technique of the previous performers. It was something else, something honest and unguarded. Eleanor reached the transition to the third movement, where her composition shifted into its most personal section. This part was about loss, the empty space her mother had left behind, the silence in the house where music had once lived. The melody became sparse, with pauses between phrases that seemed to hang in the air like questions without answers. Maestro Castellano's phone lowered slightly. His eyes lifted to watch her hands move across the keyboard. His expression remained neutral, but he was no longer looking away. The third movement gave way to the fourth, where grief transformed into memory. Here, Eleanor had woven fragments of her mother's favorite songs into her own composition. Not direct quotations, but subtle references. Echoes of Chopin and Debussy that appeared briefly before dissolving back into her original melody. It was her way of keeping her mother's musical spirit alive within her own work. As she played this section, Eleanor felt tears threatening. She blinked them back, focusing on maintaining the delicate balance between technique and emotion. This was the hardest part to play, not because of its technical demands, but because of the memories it excavated. In the audience, more conversations had ceased. Even those who had been checking their watches were now watching her with curious expressions. Something was happening in the hall, a gradual shift in attention, like a room slowly coming into focus. The maestro had put his phone away entirely. He leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed in concentration. Eleanor moved into the final movement of her piece, the one that had taken her longest to compose. This section was about finding joy again, about rediscovering beauty in ordinary moments. Sunlight through kitchen curtains, the weight of a cup of tea in her hands, the sound of rain on her roof late at night. The melody here was neither simple nor complex, but somewhere in between, like daily life itself. She incorporated an unusual harmonic structure in this part, something she'd developed through years of experimentation. The harmonies created a sense of tension that resolved in unexpected ways, leading listeners down one path before gently redirecting them to another. As she played the final movement, Eleanor forgot where she was. The grand concert hall, the prestigious audience, the renowned Maestro all faded into the background. It was just Eleanor and the piano, as it had always been. Her fingers moved with newfound confidence, no longer trembling but steady and sure. Throughout the hall, a strange phenomenon was occurring. People who had been fidgeting were now sitting still. Those who had been whispering were silent. Even the staff at the back of the hall had paused in their duties, listening. In the front row, Maestro Castellano sat perfectly erect, his eyes no longer on Eleanor's face, but fixed on her hands. His expression had changed from polite disinterest to something else entirely, a look of confusion giving way to recognition, as if he'd found something familiar in unfamiliar territory. Eleanor approached the conclusion of her piece, where all the themes came together in a final conversation. Morning light, loss, memory, and ordinary joy wove together in a tapestry of sound that was neither triumphant nor tragic but honestly human, the sum of a life not extraordinary but fully lived. Her final notes were quiet. Like a whispered secret, the last chord hung in the air, sustained by the pedal, gradually fading into silence. For 3 full seconds after she finished, the concert hall was completely still. Eleanor sat motionless, her hands still hovering over the keys, uncertain what to do next. The silence felt enormous, filling the space where applause should have been. Had she made a terrible mistake? Had her playing been so inadequate that the audience was embarrassed for her? And then someone coughed. Someone else shifted in their seat. The spell of silence broke and applause began. Hesitant at first, then growing steadier. It wasn't the thunderous ovation that had greeted Lucia Valenti or Dr. Winters. It was something more tentative, as if the audience wasn't quite sure what they had just experienced but knew it deserved acknowledgement. Eleanor rose from the bench, gathering her sheet music with unsteady hands. She turned to face the audience and gave a small, awkward bow. As she straightened, she found Maestro Castellano looking directly at her, his expression inscrutable. She waited for him to gesture for her to leave the stage, to thank her politely but dismissively. Instead, he rose from his seat and approached the steps to the stage. Eleanor felt a flash of panic. Had she violated some protocol? Was he coming to correct her? She clutched her portfolio tighter, preparing for criticism. The maestro climbed the steps with deliberate movements. He was older than she'd realized, his face lined with years of musical discipline. Up close, his presence was even more intimidating, the weight of his reputation almost tangible. He stopped a few feet from her, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that made Eleanor want to look away. She forced herself to meet his gaze, though her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. "Your composition," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "May I see it?" Eleanor blinked in surprise. This was not what she had expected. Wordlessly, she extended her portfolio, opening it to reveal her handwritten sheets. The maestro took them carefully, his eyes moving rapidly across the pages. His fingers traced a particularly complex passage in the 4th movement, following the notes as if reading a language he understood intimately. "This harmonic progression," he murmured, "and this motif development here." He looked up at her. "Where did you study, Ms. Winters?" Eleanor swallowed. "I didn't, not formally. My mother taught me until I was 17. After that, I taught myself." The maestro's eyebrows rose slightly. He looked back down at her composition, studying it with renewed attention. "And this piece," he said, "you composed it entirely yourself?" "Yes," Eleanor answered, uncertainty creeping into her voice. "Over several years." The maestro was silent for a long moment, still examining her notation. When he looked up again, something had changed in his expression, a shift so subtle Eleanor almost missed it. "Interesting," he said, the word carrying weight beyond its simplicity. He handed the portfolio back to her and turned to face the audience, who had been watching this exchange with curious expressions. The maestro stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hall, "we have just witnessed something quite remarkable." Eleanor felt her face grow warm. She wasn't sure whether to stay on stage or retreat. She compromised by taking a half step back. trying to make herself less visible while remaining where the maestro had left her. Miss Winter's composition demonstrates something we too often forget in our pursuit of technical perfection, Castellano continued. It shows us that music at its core is about communication, about speaking truths that cannot be expressed in words. The audience stirred, their attention now fully captured by this unexpected turn of events. The harmonic structures in her final movement, in particular, reveal a naturally innovative approach that is, he paused, seeming to search for the right word, genuinely original. Eleanor could hardly believe what she was hearing. The maestro, the legendary Vittorio Castellano, whose criticism had reduced virtuosos to tears, was praising her work. Her simple composition, created in the quiet hours of her ordinary life, had somehow caught his discerning ear. Thank you, Ms. Winters, the maestro said, turning back to her with a slight nod of his head, for reminding us why we gather here. He extended his hand and Eleanor stepped forward to shake it, her mind struggling to process what was happening. His grip was firm and brief, but the acknowledgement it represented was enormous. As she made her way off the stage, legs unsteady beneath her, Eleanor felt something shift in the atmosphere of the hall. People who had looked through her earlier now watched her pass. A few nodded in acknowledgement. One woman smiled warmly. Eleanor returned to her seat in a daze, her portfolio clutched against her chest. Around her she could hear whispers, catch fragments of conversation. Who did she say she studied with? Entirely self-taught, I think he said. That harmonic progression in the final movement. The maestro returned to the microphone to formally close the evening, thanking all the performers and the audience for their attendance. As the house lights came up and people began gathering their belongings, Eleanor sat still, trying to absorb what had just happened. The ordinary woman from Pine Creek, invisible just an hour ago, had somehow made herself heard. As the audience filed out of the concert hall, Eleanor remained in her seat, still processing what had just happened. People streamed past her toward the exits, many engaged in animated conversations about the evening's performances. Several glanced her way as they passed, with expressions ranging from curiosity to newfound respect. Eleanor clutched her portfolio, her fingers tracing the worn edges. Inside were pages of music that until tonight had never been heard by anyone but herself. Now those private melodies had filled this grand space, had been witnessed by hundreds of strangers, had somehow caught the attention of Maestro Castellano himself. The thought was overwhelming. Excuse me. Eleanor looked up to find a woman standing in the aisle beside her row. She was elegantly dressed in a charcoal suit, with silver streaks in her dark hair and intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses. I'm Patricia Lynn, from the Metropolitan Arts Foundation Board, the woman said, extending her hand. Your performance was quite moving. Eleanor stood awkwardly, juggling her portfolio to free a hand. Thank you. I'm Eleanor, but you probably heard that already. Patricia smiled. I was wondering if you might join us for the reception. It's just down the hall in the founder's room. The maestro usually makes an appearance, and I believe he'd like to speak with you further. Eleanor hadn't known about any reception. It certainly hadn't been mentioned on her invitation. This must be for the important people, the performers, the donors, the inner circle of the music world that she'd only glimpsed from afar. Oh, I don't think she began. Please, Patricia interrupted gently. We'd be honored to have you. Something in the woman's sincere tone made Eleanor reconsider. Perhaps this was part of the evening's strange magic, doors opening that she'd never thought to knock on. All right, she agreed, gathering her things. Thank you. Patricia led her through a side door and down a corridor Eleanor hadn't noticed before. The walls were lined with photographs of famous musicians who had performed in the concert hall over the decades. Eleanor recognized some of the faces from albums and magazine covers, legendary pianists, conductors, and composers whose work she had studied and admired from her small corner of the world. They reached a set of double doors where two staff members greeted Patricia by name. Beyond was a spacious room with high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and walls painted a deep burgundy. About 50 people milled around, balancing champagne flutes in small plates of appetizers. The air hummed with conversation and occasional laughter. Let me get you something to drink, Patricia offered. Wine? Champagne? Something non-alcoholic. Just water, please, Eleanor replied, suddenly aware of her dry throat. As Patricia moved toward the bar, Eleanor stood alone at the edge of the room, feeling conspicuously out of place. The other guests were clustered in small groups, many in animated conversation. She recognized several of the evening's performers holding court in different corners of the room, surrounded by admirers. Lucia Valenti, the brilliant young pianist in the scarlet dress, was at the center of the largest group, her laugh carrying across the space as she recounted some amusing anecdote. Dr. Winters, the distinguished older pianist who had preceded Eleanor in the impromptu session, was engaged in serious conversation with two tuxedo-clad gentlemen near a large floral arrangement. Eleanor shifted her weight from one foot to the other, uncertain where to look or what to do with her hands. She hadn't expected to be included in this gathering, and hadn't prepared herself for further social interactions. Playing her composition had depleted her emotional reserves. Now she felt raw and exposed like a turtle without its shell. "They won't bite, you know," the voice came from beside her. Eleanor turned to find a man about her own age with kind eyes and a slight smile. He wore a simple black suit that, like Eleanor's dress, wasn't quite as fashionable as what most guests were wearing. "The musical elite," he clarified, nodding toward the room. "They can seem intimidating, but they're just people who happen to find the right teachers at the right time. Or the right connections," Eleanor added, surprising herself with her candor. The man laughed. "That too. I'm Thomas, by the way. I'm the recording engineer for the foundation. I was in the sound booth during your performance." "Oh," Eleanor felt a flush of embarrassment. "I hope the levels weren't too irregular. I probably didn't maintain consistent volume." Thomas shook his head. "Your dynamics were perfect, natural. That's surprisingly rare, even among professionals. Most classical performers today play with such technical precision that they forget music needs to breathe." Before Eleanor could respond, Patricia returned with a glass of water. "I see you've met our Thomas," she said, handing the glass to Eleanor. "He's been with us for nearly a decade now, documenting all our performances." "Which means I've heard a lot of piano playing," Thomas added, "including tonight's recital." Patricia's attention was caught by someone across the room. "Excuse me," she said. "The donor relations director is waving frantically. Thomas, would you introduce Eleanor to some of our regulars? I'll be back shortly." As Patricia hurried away, Thomas gave Eleanor an understanding look. "We can just stand here quietly if you prefer. You don't have to meet anyone else tonight if you're not up to it." Eleanor took a sip of water, gathering her thoughts. "It's not that I don't want to meet people. It's just I'm not sure what to say. Everyone here seems so accomplished." "So are you," Thomas pointed out. "Your composition was the most honest musical statement I've heard in this hall for years." "You're very kind. I'm very truthful. It's a professional requirement when working with temperamental artists." He smiled again. "Speaking of which, don't look now, but Maestro Castellano just walked in." Eleanor couldn't help herself. She glanced toward the entrance where the maestro had indeed appeared. He was immediately surrounded by several well-dressed patrons, all eager for his attention. Despite being the center of a small crowd, he somehow maintained a space around himself, an invisible barrier that kept others at a respectful distance. "He's like a planet with its own gravitational field," Thomas observed. "Everyone orbits around him at carefully calculated distances." "He must get tired of it," Eleanor said without thinking. "Tired of adoration?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Tired of performance," Eleanor clarified. "Not on stage, that's the easy part. It's this." She gestured vaguely toward the social dance happening around them. "Having to be Maestro Castellano every moment in public." Thomas studied her with newfound interest. "That's insightful, and probably accurate, though he'd never admit it." He took a sip from his own glass. "So, Eleanor, where are you from, actually?" "Pine Creek. It's a small town about 2 hours north of here." "Eleanor from Pine Creek, what will you do now? After tonight?" The question caught her off guard. She hadn't thought beyond surviving the recital. "Go home, I suppose. Teach my students on Monday. Life goes on. Even after you've stunned the maestro. That doesn't happen every day, you know." "I didn't stun him," Eleanor protested. "He was just being kind." Thomas actually laughed at this. "Vittorio Castellano is many things, but kind isn't one of them. Not professionally, anyway. He once told a world-renowned pianist that his interpretation of Beethoven sounded like a dishwasher full of spoons. No, if the maestro praised your work, it's because it deserved praise." Eleanor didn't know how to respond to this. The possibility that her composition had genuine merit in the eyes of someone like Castellano was both thrilling and terrifying. What would it mean? What would it change? Before she could formulate a response, she noticed a shift in the room's energy. Conversations quieted slightly as the maestro extricated himself from his admirers and began moving through the crowd. He stopped to exchange brief words with several guests but kept moving, as if searching for someone specific. With growing amazement, Eleanor realized he was making his way in her direction. "Looks like you're about to have another conversation with the man himself," Thomas murmured. "Remember to breathe." Eleanor barely had time to heed this advice before Maestro Castellano stood before her. Up close, his presence was even more formidable than it had been on stage. His silver hair was immaculately styled, his posture perfect, his gaze direct and evaluating. "Ms. Winters," he said, his voice carrying the faint traces of an Italian accent. "I'm pleased you could join us." "Thank you for inviting me," Eleanor replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "To the recital, I mean. And now here." The maestro nodded. "I've been thinking about your composition." He turned slightly to acknowledge Thomas. "Chen, good evening." "Maestro," Thomas replied with a respectful nod. Castellano returned his attention to Eleanor. "Would you mind if we spoke privately for a moment? There's a small sitting area just through those doors." He gestured toward a side exit. Eleanor glanced at Thomas, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Of course," she said to the maestro. As they moved away, Thomas raised his glass in a small toast. Eleanor followed Castellano across the room, acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. The maestro nodded to acquaintances as they passed but didn't stop to chat, maintaining a purposeful stride toward the doorway. The sitting area beyond was a stark contrast to the bustling reception, a quiet space with several armchairs arranged around low tables. A wall of windows looked out over the city skyline, the buildings illuminated against the night sky. The maestro closed the door behind them, muffling the sounds of the party. "Please sit," he said, indicating one of the chairs. Eleanor perched on the edge of the seat, her portfolio still clutched in her hands like a shield. The maestro took the chair opposite her, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "Your composition," he began, "is technically unrefined." Eleanor's heart sank. So Thomas had been wrong. The maestro's praise on stage had been mere politeness, perhaps even pity. "But," Castellano continued, "it possesses something far rarer than technical precision. It has authenticity, particularly that final movement, with its unusual harmonic structure." "Where did that come from?" Eleanor considered how to answer. "It just sounded right to me. I experimented until I found the progression that matched what I heard in my head." The maestro nodded slowly. "Without formal training, you've somehow arrived at a sound that many composers spend years trying to discover. That's either extraordinary luck or extraordinary intuition." He leaned forward slightly. "I'd like to hear more of your work, Ms. Winters. And I believe others should hear it too." Eleanor stared at Maestro Castellano, certain she had misheard him. "You want to hear more of my work?" "That's what I said." The maestro's expression remained serious. "Do you have other compositions?" "Yes," Eleanor admitted. "Several. But they're like this one. Personal pieces I created for myself. They're not—" She hesitated, searching for the right word. "They're not important works. Importance is not determined by the composer's reputation, Ms. Winters, but by what the music itself has to say." Castellano leaned back in his chair, his gaze still fixed on her. "I'm starting a new workshop series next month. A small group of composers working together for 8 weeks to develop their unique voices. I'd like you to join us." Eleanor's mind raced. A workshop with Maestro Castellano was an opportunity most musicians would sacrifice years of their lives for. But she had her students in Pine Creek, her small house with its garden that would need tending as spring approached. Her predictable life that, while not exciting, was comfortable in its familiarity. "I don't know if I can," she said quietly. "I teach piano. My students depend on me. Arrangements can be made. The workshop meets on weekends. You could return to your teaching during the week if necessary." He paused, studying her face. "Unless you're not interested." "No, it's not that," Eleanor said quickly. "It's just unexpected. I came here tonight thinking I might hear some beautiful music. maybe gather ideas for my students. I never imagined that you would be the one providing the ideas. The corner of Castellano's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Sometimes the most valuable voices are those that don't realize their own worth. He reached into his jacket and produced a small card. My contact information. The workshop begins the first weekend of next month. There are 10 places. I'm offering one to you. Eleanor accepted the card, its heavy cream stock embossed with the Maestro's name and contact details. It felt surreal in her hand, a tangible connection to a world she'd only observed from afar. Think about it, Castellano said, but don't think too long. Opportunities rarely announce themselves twice. He stood, signaling the end of their conversation. Now I'm afraid I have obligations to attend to. Stay and enjoy the reception if you wish. Patricia will see that you're introduced to people who might interest you. With a slight nod, he moved toward the door, then paused. That harmonic progression in your final movement, he said without turning around. It reminds me of something Debussy once tried but never fully developed. You might look into his later experimental works. Then he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and the small card that somehow weighed as heavy as stone in her palm. She remained seated for several minutes, staring out at the city lights beyond the window. Her ordinary life in Pine Creek seemed very far away now, as if she'd stepped through some invisible doorway into a parallel world where Eleanor Winters, piano teacher, was suddenly Eleanor Winters, composer. The door opened and Thomas appeared with 2 fresh glasses of water. I saw the Maestro return to the lion's den, he said, handing her one of the glasses. Thought you might need this. Thank you. Eleanor took a grateful sip. Her throat felt parched from the evening's emotions. So, Thomas prompted, taking the seat Castellano had vacated. What did the great man have to say? Eleanor hesitated, still processing the conversation herself. He invited me to join his composer's workshop. It starts next month. Thomas's eyebrows rose. The Castellano workshop? That's extraordinary. Only a handful of composers are selected each year. People apply from all over the world. He said there are 10 places, and they're usually filled by competition winners, conservatory standouts, rising stars with major performances already under their belts. Thomas shook his head in amazement. For him to offer you a spot after hearing just one piece. He whistled softly. You must have really impressed him. Or he made a mistake, Eleanor said, voicing the doubt that had begun creeping into her mind. Maybe he'll reconsider once he hears more of my work. Or maybe he'll be even more impressed. Thomas studied her curiously. You really don't see it, do you? See what? What happened tonight? You walked onto that stage as an unknown and walked off as someone worth knowing. That doesn't happen by accident. Eleanor looked down at the card in her hand, tracing the embossed letters with her fingertip. I'm just a piano teacher from a small town. And tonight you were also a composer who silenced a room full of critics and connoisseurs. Thomas leaned forward. Look, I've been recording performances here for 9 years. I've seen brilliant technicians who could play anything put in front of them, but couldn't make the audience feel a thing. And I've seen lesser-known musicians bring people to tears with just a few simple notes played with complete honesty. He gestured toward the reception beyond the doors. Out there, most of them are chasing perfection. You're chasing truth. That's rarer than you think. Eleanor took another sip of water, letting his words sink in. Could it be true? Had her simple composition, born from personal experience rather than academic training, really connected with these sophisticated listeners? What will you do? Thomas asked. About the workshop? Eleanor sighed. I don't know. It would mean rearranging my whole life. Finding someone to cover my students on weekends, driving back and forth to the city. Or staying here on weekends, Thomas suggested. The foundation has apartments for visiting artists. I'm sure they could arrange something. It's not just the logistics, Eleanor admitted. It's stepping into this world. I'm not sure I belong here. Thomas laughed softly. None of us were born belonging anywhere, Eleanor. We find our places by showing up and doing the work that matters to us. From beyond the doors came the sound of increased activity, voices saying goodbyes, the clink of glasses being collected. Looks like the reception is winding down, Thomas observed. Do you need a ride somewhere? Or did you drive in? I drove. My car's in the public garage down the street. Let me walk you there at least. The city can be confusing at night. They rejoined the reception, which had indeed begun to disperse. Patricia spotted them and hurried over, her expression bright with excitement. "Eleanor, I've been looking for you. I've told several board members about your performance, and they're very interested in hearing more of your work. And I understand the Maestro has invited you to his workshop." News traveled fast in these circles, Eleanor realized. "Yes, he mentioned it. Wonderful. We'll need to get your information so we can send you the details. And of course, we'll want to include you in our promotional materials for next season. Perhaps a feature in our donor newsletter? A profile of a newly discovered composer would be just the thing to excite our patrons." The speed at which her life was being rearranged made Eleanor's head spin. "I haven't actually decided yet," she began. Patricia looked genuinely surprised. "But surely you'll accept. This is an extraordinary opportunity. Composers wait years for a chance like this." Thomas stepped in smoothly. "I think Eleanor needs a little time to consider what this means for her teaching commitments." "Right, Eleanor?" Eleanor shot him a grateful look. "Yes, exactly. I have responsibilities to my students." Of course, Patricia nodded, though she looked puzzled that anyone would hesitate. "Well, take my card, too. Call me when you've decided, or if you have any questions about the program." She handed Eleanor another business card, this one bearing the Metropolitan Arts Foundation logo. After exchanging a few more pleasantries, Thomas and Eleanor made their goodbyes and headed for the exit. As they walked through the now quiet corridors of the concert hall, Eleanor felt the weight of the evening's event settling over her like a heavy cloak. Outside, the night air was cool and refreshing after the warmth of the reception. The street was relatively quiet, with only a few taxis passing by and the occasional group of well-dressed concert-goers heading for their cars or the nearby restaurants. "Public garage is this way," Thomas said, gesturing to the right. "Mind if I ask what's really holding you back? It's not just your students, is it?" Eleanor walked beside him in silence for a moment. "No," she finally admitted. "It's fear, I suppose. Fear that I'll be found out as an imposter, that my music isn't actually good enough for this world, that I'll disappoint everyone, including myself. The classic imposter syndrome. Trust me, even the greatest musicians feel that way sometimes. Even Maestro Castellano." Thomas laughed. "Especially him. Why do you think he's so demanding? He's terrified of falling short of his own impossible standards." They reached the entrance to the parking garage, its fluorescent lights harsh after the soft glow of the concert hall. "Well, this is me," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the entrance. Thomas nodded. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Eleanor from Pine Creek. Whatever you decide about the workshop, I hope you'll keep composing. The world needs more music that speaks from the heart. Thank you for being kind tonight. It helped more than you know." "Not kindness, recognition." Thomas smiled. "Drive safely." Eleanor made her way through the garage to her car, her mind still buzzing with the events of the evening. As she settled into the driver's seat, she placed the 2 business cards on the passenger seat beside her. 2 small rectangles of heavy paper that represented a door to a different future than the one she had imagined for herself. She started the engine and began the 2-hour drive home. As the city lights faded behind her and the familiar countryside unfolded in her headlights, Eleanor found herself humming the main theme from her composition, the notes as clear in her mind as if they were still hanging in the air of the concert hall. By the time she turned onto her street in Pine Creek, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Her small house waited just as she had left it, porch light on. Frederick the cat probably curled on her bed, everything familiar and unchanged. But as she parked in her driveway and gathered her things, Eleanor knew that while her surroundings might be the same, she herself was not. The woman who had left this house yesterday, clutching an invitation and battling nerves, was not quite the same woman who now returned with 2 business cards and a head full of possibilities. She unlocked her front door and stepped inside, setting her keys in their usual place on the small table by the entrance. Frederick appeared, stretching and yawning before winding himself around her ankles in greeting. "You'll never guess what happened," she told him, bending to stroke his soft fur. The first light of morning filtered through her curtains, illuminating her piano in the corner of the living room. Eleanor moved toward it, drawn as she had been countless times before. She sat on the bench and placed her hands on the keys, not yet playing, just feeling their familiar coolness beneath her fingers. The world beyond Pine Creek was waiting now. A door cracked open by an unexpected melody and a maestro who had actually listened. Whether she would step fully through that door remained to be seen. But for now, in the quiet of her small house as a new day dawned, Eleanor began to play, adding new notes to her composition. The next chapter of her story, as yet unwritten but suddenly full of possibility.